Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today I have a very special guest. Very honored to have him back on the channel, the Nathan Hood. Welcome back to the show, Nathan.
Hey Connor, good to see you again, and great to be here again. Have you had a good New Year?
Yeah, I mean, so I got like sick over Christmas, or my
Oh,
family got sick over Christmas. So it was a slow starting Christmas, and then
mm,
just kind of going back to sort of my sort of a diet. I kind of had some, I indulged myself a little bit over Christmas, and now I'm
yeah.
back on the normal sort of diet routine.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I was on a similar thing. I had too many chocolate treats and turkey. I don't know. In America, do you guys eat turkey for Christmas Day? I know it's
No,
more
that
of a thing at Thanksgiving, right?
yeah, that's a very Thanksgiving thing. I think at least in
Mhm.
my family, it's more like steak or something like that.
Oh, okay. Because like over here, the thing to have is a turkey for Christmas,
Well, you
and
guys don't
so
have Thanksgiving.
right, exactly. So we all put on a lot of pounds, having eaten lots and lots of turkey over Christmas. So slowly working it off, getting back to the shape I was before Christmas.
I'm still not sure why Canadians have a Thanksgiving.
They have Thanksgiving too.
Yeah,
I
well,
didn't realize.
they have theirs in October though,
Oh, they just have to
but
be different.
yeah, they do. But like, well, they have to be us, but also different. Like
Mm,
they're wannabes. They're like, oh, we'll have a Thanksgiving. We're gonna be different from both the British and the
mm.
Americans, and have a Thanksgiving and have it in October. I don't know.
It's I mean, this is the sort of talk that you'll be able to impose the proper Thanksgiving when America invades Canada, right?
Yes, there is quite a bit of discussion about that. Though Greenland, I think, is
Oh, is that the priority?
probably. I think Trump, because Trump's wanted Greenland even like in his last term.
That's right. He talked about buying it, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, uh, you never know what's going to happen with him. Um,
No, that's true. That is
but
true.
we're here more to talk about fiction. So I want to first you
Mhm,
sort of asked a question on AI's New Year's stream about sort
mhm.
of what we have to do, or what our goals should be, what our priorities should be regarding fiction this year. And I would like you to sort of expand on what you mean and what you're thinking about regarding that.
Well, I think there's a lot of different things in there to maybe to kind of get to because that question is probably the result of like a year or two's kind of exploration of stories, mythology, and so on. And as you know, Connor, my kind of channel and interest is in mythology and well, fantasy stories as well. Lord of the Rings is the thing that brought us together, I think, and
Well,
many of us in this sphere.
even though
And
Star Wars was actually the first time I was on your channel.
oh, right, okay, okay,
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Um, but yeah, I love the Lord of the Rings, and I think it's become a very strong influence upon my way of understanding the world. And in part, that's led me to kind of explore the Saxon and the Norse stories, the tales of Ragnarok, for example. This idea that we're in a declining age, which is going to come to an end, that things don't always get better. That's brought into the Lord of the Rings with a Christian twist. But the thing that I wanted to kind of that was kind of I was wrestling with for a while was, are these stories the right stories for now? Because many of us are writing stories which are inspired by Tolkien. There are other fantasy writers who have kind of rejected that line. I would
Hmm.
say someone like George R. R. Martin or Michael Moorcock. That's a much more nihilistic world, but that's not the impression I get of the guys writing in our um, kind of community online. They tend to be more in that Tolkien track, let's say. with changes. It's not a copy, but like, it's kind of that world and those values. Um, but it seems to me that Tolkien, this sort of idea of heroic Saxon men, men of Rohan, men of Gondor, let's say, making a final stand against overwhelming odds, which is really Ragnarok for men. This is a kind of autumnal story because there's still something to fight for. There's still something good that can be defended and maintained. And the defeat, which doesn't happen in Tolkien but does in the Norse mythology, that is then the beginning of winter. And the kinds of hero then that you're going to have are guardian types of heroes. They're not ones who are actively creating a new society or kingdom or something like that. They're not a Clovis, for example, forging the what's going to become the Carolingian Empire, right? It's not Alfred the Great forging England out of the ashes of the Saxon realms. It's not Julius Caesar. Rather, it's men holding the line against wave and wave of attack of the monsters. So that's that kind of society. Maybe like Batman is a similar sort of character. The superhero is a similar character. He guards the current order and tries to maintain it even while it's crumbling. And somewhere like Gotham is crumbling, right? It's almost there's nothing to defend, and yet Batman keeps defending it.
Yeah, it's kind of illogical in some ways because if if you're going through basically 70 years of the same situation, is it really worth it?
Well, that's precisely my question, right? Aragorn, Gandalf, and co. They have something that's worth defending. I think everyone would accept that Gondor and Rohan are worth defending. The Shire is worth fighting for. Is Gotham worth fighting for? Or if it is, let me rephrase that. Is it worth fighting for as it currently is?
It's a very well, it's such a weird situation because in some ways they're just not providing the cure. It's
Mm-hmm.
Batman is truly just staving off the apocalypse.
And what's interesting in those films, and I think you see it in others, and King Emperor Penguin wrote a very good article about this, is that it's only the villains who are allowed to propose significant change. So it's somebody like Bane who's going to open all of the prisons and give Gotham to the people, right? Something
Mhm.
anarchic and like that. So it automatically villainizes anyone who suggests the radical change that is actually required. I'm not saying what Bane is the cure, but whatever it is, it's not just carrying on.
Do
The
you think
same
that's
is
a
also true
sort
in
of a
Star Wars, right? It's the Jedi and co just maintain while it's Sidious is or Palpatine is the only one who's kind of bringing decisive action and change. Now, you might disagree with what he's going to do in forging an empire, but he's the only one who's kind of allowed within that world to offer a decisive sort of alternative. And so it's the film implicitly kind of villainizes anyone who would make those sorts of suggestions. So it becomes it's kind of that's the only place you can have that opinion within those stories. But then so I'm getting to why I asked that question then, and I think maybe you'll be able to see where I'm going with this. These stories are good for a previous time potentially, especially the Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And I'm not saying it doesn't speak to us now, but in terms of writing new stories or writing, trying to contribute to that tradition and speak to us today, if we write that kind of tale, does it feel a little bit like writing as if we're Batman defending Gotham? Is that the kind of archetype we're actually proposing there? As opposed to maybe we need to start thinking about a different kind of hero, the hero that in the winter establishes the new kingdom, the hero who actually brings the cure to Gotham, for example. These are That's kind of an open question that I don't know the answer to, but it was these sorts of things that were in my mind when I asked that question, and have been trying to wrestle with it ever since, really. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah, well, you bring up sort of the fact that the villains are only the ones proposing basically changes or possible solutions to the problem of society. And do you think that's really just because the authors of those stories have no answers to they only see things as sort of anything that's an attack on the current paradigm is an evil because they have no solutions and they basically have no real imagination for those solutions.
I think, um, hmm. Well, I think it's two things there. I think on the one hand that you're right that that's a big part of it, that they don't have the imagination of what could be a solution. Um, but it's also bound up with the idea that although, um, someone like, or it's also bound up with the idea that modernity and liberal democracy as it is today, while there are many problems with it, is still the best system. And these
Yeah,
people
that
buy that system for, so anything against that, anything that challenges that is automatically like demonic, right? So I think that's a big part of it, that it's so ingrained, that mentality, that you know the it can only be a villain who would challenge such a thing, even though it evidently doesn't work, and their own stories convey that it's not working. Yeah.
Well, it seems to me that's why they could not tell the or either George Lucas or Disney could not tell the sequel trilogy
Mm,
in the manner that I would say fans like myself, at least I would say when I was a fan, it's hard for me to say that I'm necessarily a fan of Star Wars anymore.
yeah.
At least I'm a fan of the concepts and stuff like that, but I'm not necessarily a fan of what it is anymore because what you're expecting after the destruction of the Death Star and the sort of downfall of the Emperor is a creation of a better world, of some society in the
Mm,
galaxy that is of higher quality. And it seems to me that their interpretation is almost uh, that if you think about like the original trilogy as like World War II, uh, the the um, the sequel trilogy is kind of representative of what they think today is. Today
mm,
is like we restored the Republic, but it's faltered and there is a new enemy arising, out of the ashes of the empire. And the let's just say the modern villains are either Russia or China, let's just say that. And they're sort of the remnants of the destruction of the former evils that were fought previously. Like
yeah, and
they can't fathom a successful society that doesn't bring about those evils again.
and which makes you question, the why those societies bring those evils about, but they don't seem to reflect on that. I mean, to me, I was thinking about this earlier. A really great example of this sort of phenomenon is the Matrix trilogy. I haven't watched the fourth one, so I have no idea if that changes everything or not. But let's just take the original three. The What is the alternative to being plugged into the Matrix? It's basically just like liberal, modern liberal democracy with raves. Like, is it any different from our society, really? Like, um, not really. It's just the same thing. They want the Matrix without the robots in control.
Well, it's
That's
like
it.
so I'm reading a book by Paul Gottfried on the sort of fascism, on what fascism is.
Mm,
And he breaks down various different interpretations of fascism by various different groups, and he's talking about the Frankfurt School's view of fascism, like where it
Mm,
comes from, and basically their belief is that it's psychological, like it's in the psyche,
mm,
and that their goal is to make sure the psyche can never be uh, revived of fascism. Like fascism can never come back through the psyche by destroying all versions of prejudice
yeah.
in the psyche, which is sounds impossible. Uh, but the point of that is that they think there's something within the human that will always come back to their understanding of fascism. And in some ways,
Mm.
that's kind of seems like that's the same interpretation of what they have in something like Star Wars.
That's a very good point, and I think that that's a lot of what's going on today. Is a lot of the stories, and I guess this is a kind of slightly distinct issue because there's the future of story writing in our community, and then there's the future of story writing more generally in pop culture and the various rehashes that we get of and reboots and sequels and all that. But in
There's nothing
those,
that's not a sequel or a reboot that's pretty much coming out. So
yeah, yeah, and I mean the focus on of them is in part this kind of uh, supremacy of um, anti-fascism, let's call it that, or anti-racism, or something like that.
mhm.
And so the stories are not no longer stories; they're just vehicles for the triumph of this over the other. Um, and you can see that with Star Wars, with the Rings of Power. Take whatever one you want, and it's some kind of victory in that direction. But it becomes then, well, there's two things. One is it's just propaganda then in a lot of cases, and very kind of vindictive propaganda, very kind of personal. You feel like some of the writers, it's like a you know they're getting revenge on somebody by doing this or writing in a certain way, discrediting, subverting older characters who they see as like markers for a kind of usually a white male of some kind who they have animosity towards. Um, but more than that, they rob the form of the story of its inner power. So they keep the skin, the surface level, the clothing of Star Wars, but they remove that which gave it spirit, that which gave it life. Because at the end of the day, you can have all the spaceships, you can have all the Jedi and the Sith, you can have the lightsaber battles, but what made it special was something that can't be pinned down to any one of those things. It was a good story which had a very compelling narrative, touching on deep mythological things and drawing on them. And this was appealing to many people because it resonates with things inside of us, things that are natural to us, things which
The
they would
soul.
claim are fascistic. So in a way, what that does, so that emphasis on the kind of anti-fascism, what that does then is they've just all they've got is a kind of tired out, worn out, um, surface level thing, as opposed to the actual story itself. So then it becomes inauthentic, loses authority. It's a tired authority than what it once was.
They bought skin suits basically. Um, and
Yeah.
and and it's perfect because at the same time they're buying and producing skin suits, we were also being masked up. Like every
Mm,
aspect of us had to be sort of depersonalized. We were no longer sort of individual people that
yeah.
um, that had purpose or that uh, had agency, but we were turned basically into skin suits of ourselves.
I think so. I think so. And then so we became. I think that's a good point. There's a reduction of all these things. There's a loss of that kind of fabric which bound people together and people to the stories together. And then what's the kind of practical impact of that? Well, in essence, then you have things like what fan service and nostalgia, and the force be with you. I have a bad feeling about this. They become like very empty. The suit of Vader, the clone soldier's armor, it all becomes a kind of just hollow shell of what it once was. Something which actually had a bit of verve to it, something which spoke to us and gave us a thrill. It just feels very worn out. And people talk about like what do they call it? I can't. What there was this kind of term that people were using when there was too many Marvel films in a year or
Oh,
something.
was it
Fatigue.
bloat? Fatigue. Fatigue.
Um,
Yeah, like
but I
superhero
think
fatigue.
I think they were kind of onto something, but they had the wrong idea about it. It wasn't that there was too many films. It's that the story, by being robbed of its heroic content, had become like tiring to us. The characters had no power anymore to move us. So that's where the fatigue comes. It's not actually in the how many films there are, because I think you could release uh, if it's a really good TV show or film, people will come and watch it. Like
Well, yeah.
we've had things like that, like people binge like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos or whatever. They don't seem to get fatigued with The Sopranos, right?
Well,
Like,
yeah, it's funny. It's kind of like one of my favorite. I've been watching a lot of British TV
mm,
as of late, and one of my favorites is Yes Prime Minister, Yes
oh
Minister
yeah,
type of thing,
yeah,
and I would love to have more. I wish, of that. Like there's no desire of me of getting bored with the
mm,
types of stories or what the sort of or of the characters. It's like, kind of how most American TV shows used to go for like 10 seasons or something, and they would have like 24 episodes.
yeah,
Like,
right,
that's insane. I mean, that's such a high level of time that people have, put into those stories. Not to mention, it's not that people aren't watching TV and at a or if they're not watching TV at a lesser rate these
mm,
days. If anything, they're just watching old things. They're
that's
rewatching old things. That's why they're subscribed to streaming services. It's not to watch
mm,
anything new, it's to watch everything old, and they're rewatching it over and over and over again because it's sort of the their practice of like safety. It feels good to them kind of thing because it
mm,
feels sort of, at least there seems to be some sort of authenticity. It's kind of like, in some ways, they if they are looking at it like, okay, we need to use these works as sort of some sort of anti-fascism, right? To
mm,
destroy sort of what they think what they think is sort of a fascistic power trip or something like that. Because that's often what, sort of like superheroes or, fantasy shows or fantasy movies are often characterized as like fascistic power trips. I
yeah,
think even like what is it? Gunn, what's his name? The Guardians of the Galaxy director, who's
James
now
Gunn.
James Gunn. He's in charge of DC, and he like called, I think, Zack Snyder's universe like fascistic, and then he kind of took it back.
Yeah.
Like
Hmm.
I think he was like, "Oh no, I don't really mean that," which is interesting because in a different time, I feel like he would have just kept with that. He would have like
Yeah.
fully gone on. There's definitely some change, but the point is, if you're thinking about it as sort of just anti-fascist, um, like movement or background, it's kind of weird because they also keep the what they would consider fascistic, like, styling. Like,
Mhm.
with the skin suit, they can't lose the actual sort of outer aspects that they consider fascistic, but they just have to destroy everything inner in order to destroy any joy or any fascistic intention or something like that, or that they that would bring about an effect, like you talking about the clone trooper army, or armor, or the stormtrooper
Mhm.
armor, like that's those things are very cool to the general populace. And yeah, they even George Lucas would probably say that they were kind of inspired by sort of the mid-century Germans as like an archetype of sort of scary villains and
Mhm.
stuff like that. So yes, they have that, but they kept that part. They kept the outer part, even though they disagree with the inner part, and they corrupt the inner part. So everything's even more sort of I don't know, hollowed out than even what sort of even George Lucas says, probably what I would imagine he's an avowed anti-fascist. He wasn't
Mhm.
trying to make a fascist story, but but their criticisms are, I don't know, so much bigger than what they used to be, I guess.
Well, no, I mean, the thing with Lucas is he kind of, to me, defies some of these trends because his heart lies in good storytelling, and we can debate, the prequels and how much help he had and all that. I know people go into that, but at the end of the day, he loved. Um, he was trying to seek, those deep truths in reality in what way he could. Um, he read Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces and applied that to Star Wars. And then when he moves into the prequel trilogy, he's trying to still bring that into things, but applying it to I think, a certain kind of it's both a criticism of fascism, but also of American bureaucratic Republican life, and reflecting on realities. He's not. I don't think he's kind of ideologically driven to hammer home a message, but rather he's trying to reflect what he sees in the world. And maybe that's a point to make here, is we live in an age of strong ideology. People have this sort of set of views and others have this set of views, and they seem to clash all the time. It almost becomes like a sports game where one team is versus another. And
That's
so
what elections are, basically. They
that's what elections are, yeah.
Yeah, they're a sporting event for the ideologies.
And it can get to a condition where you argue to defend your candidate, no matter, even though last year you were against the policy they're now putting forward, or things like that,
Yes.
or so a good example of this sort of thing is, oh, Trump was evil because he had caging on the border, let's say. Oh, but Obama did it. Oh, but he's okay because he's my guy, but Trump's a bad guy, so therefore it's a bad thing now. And you can do it uh both ways on this. So whereas I don't think Lucas is that way driven. He's not blinded to what's there by his personal loyalty to an ideology or to a movement or something. He's reflecting what he sees and feels about the world in his
But
stories, and that gives it an authenticity and richness which something like the sequel trilogy doesn't have, because it's got a predefined message which closes off that openness to real life.
I agree. George Lucas is sincere. Like
Hmm.
he's a sincere creative, and I guess the point is that even though he has those sort of inclinations that I think he is still sort of pushing somewhat,
Hmm.
um he's not trying to sacrifice the art for the sake of that. He actually just lets the art unfold, and in that it finds something that everyone can find meaning in, or be drawn to and enjoy.
I think that's right, and it well, I mean, it gets to one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of the future of storytelling, and it's kind of tricky in this current moment because a lot of people want to make a point in their stories, and that's the primary thing. It's the political angle, a commentary on the decline of the West or on progressive politics or something like that. And you see this sort of thing, I think, with there's certain kind of like conservative companies um, who try to kind of make a conservative version of left-wing media.
Hmm.
So I haven't seen all of their stuff, so I couldn't say this about everything, but it just strikes me that like some of what the Daily Wire tries to do is
Yeah.
is kind of like this. Whereas I think actually like if it's just about the artistic process, that's a kind of dangerous thing because it goes outside of um, ideology. It's actually in a different realm, really. If you're going to let people just make good art, and it's going to speak to probably above and beyond these debates, and maybe challenge on all sides because it's trying to engage with reality and with things beyond just the political. That doesn't mean it can't have a political edge. I think it will necessarily have that, but um, it might not sit comfortably with everything that we politically stand for. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Actually, maybe we should be allowing good stories to challenge us in that way.
Well, it's kind of like if you become a ideologue to the point where you're basically just um on one team versus another team, and you're basically playing that sort of sports that sports battle out in your head. You're not really having your own ideas. You're not really saying anything profound or worth hearing,
Mm,
which is why I think the Daily Wire itself is generally declining in interest.
interesting. Yeah.
It's still profitable, but it's had a lot of sort of moments of downturn, of lacking that sort of some authenticity, and also just lacking any real difference, I guess, between them and the left wing version of them. It, I
Mm.
think, and the reason, like, it's kind of like they're I haven't seen this movie, but it's basically, I think it's called Run Hide Fight, is basically a girl boss movie. uh
Right.
like, and somebody asked them, I remember distinctly, somebody asked them in a, like, on a uh was it a, like, it's like one of those, like, they were where they all sit down in like a circle or whatever and talk.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think it's called Backstage.
They have all
In
their
there,
cigars and things, right?
yes, and
Yeah.
somebody asked, When are you going to make movies with, like, a male protagonist, like, about, like, that's geared
Mm,
towards a male audience?" And I felt like the answer was really, like, really pathetic, because it was kind of like a, we're just we don't have the power over who submits us, like, work, like movies, like, because they're, like, looking at scripts, like there's, like, they're Hollywood
mm,
producers, like they're still using the same
mm.
people that are basically submitting scripts. It's just, oh yeah, maybe they have, like, a little difference with that, they couldn't get this movie done through a normal studio or like a Hollywood studio, and they're just,
Yeah.
oh, okay, well, I can't do that, so I'm going to try and see if the Daily Wire want to make it. Well, that just means they're not looking at alternative places
Mhm.
for stories. They're looking literally at the same place that all the other Hollywood studios are looking for movies, so of course they're going to basically create a sort of leftist movie with like a Republican edge. And I mean Republican, I don't mean like
Hmm.
believing in a republic. I mean the party, like the party line.
Yeah, yeah, and what there was something that you mentioned which I think maybe gets to some of the heart of this. You mentioned that you know they're coming from it with ideological lenses, and it's almost a rationalistic approach to a story. It's we have this sort of set of objectives and we will tell them in this tale, and so you impose beliefs into a story. But to my mind, I don't think that's where great art or storytelling comes from. I think it primarily emerges through um, uncontrolled thought and feeling, or inspired thought and feeling. What do I mean by that? I think of Wagner, for example, Richard Wagner. His operas, he did not sit down and, okay, I'm going to write Tristan and Isolde today and think through all of the political messages that I'm going to get in there. Now, he was a very political fellow. I will not dispute that. And he did put his political messages in his operas. But where did that come from? He tells us one day the idea arose in his mind and he felt the story within him. And so all of that planning and thought and composition, the rational side complements that intuition that arose in him without his kind of deliberate prompting. Or you think of Tolkien, and he has this idea of the mulch of the mind. It's all of these things that he's read, which he's encountered. They give rise to something. The compost heap gives rise to certain thoughts and ideas which he couldn't have planned before. They just have to emerge naturally, or without being beckoned, as it were. And I mean, George MacDonald, who was a very big influence on Tolkien, he has a similar view, but he would say this is actually the divine. This is how the divine works. It creates a man who could have the idea of the Lord of the Rings, but not in a rational process. It's through this kind of emergent phenomenon almost. So to me, the good art or great art and stories and so on, you cannot politically and rationally prescribe them before the fact. They emerge through feeling and these kind of sudden moments of inspiration or gradual moments of inspiration. Whereas that kind of approach you've outlined is the antithesis of that, and maybe that's why it lacks that fire which makes you compelled to respond to something which is good.
This was the exact problem that George Lucas had with the Hollywood system of making movies, the studio system. Basically, it was basically his problem is that the studios were then making like the story choices on behalf of the creators because
Mm,
that's what they considered what was going to sell.
yeah,
Sort of in some ways marketing is the worst aspect of our society at the moment. I mean, just think about like even watching ads. They are the
yeah.
most insufferable things you will ever watch. The only time an
Mm,
ad is ever half decent is if there's an actual story behind it. Like
that's true.
an actual beauty aspect to it, like something human. Everything is so artificial and materialistic and um, like uh, just sort of geared towards sort of a checklist, basically.
Mm. Yeah, and there's that famous kind of phrase of the writing by committee as well.
Yeah,
And
well, and George Lucas considered his real like he said basically he's like that he had become the studio system. that he had
Mm.
sworn to destroy.
You were
Like,
meant to destroy the Sith, not become them.
yes, and then he sold his property to the Ultimate Studio.
See, he was actually Anakin all along. He was just telling us this, and he needs some young filmmaker to become his Luke Skywalker
Yeah,
and forgive him.
what is George Lucas's redemption? Can he be brought back?
Could he buy it back? Is that possible?
Well, here's the problem. He would have to overcome the fact that he owns Disney stock, and
Uh,
that's why he defends Disney's work, because his basically retirement is locked up in the
mm.
success of Disney.
Yeah, he has got a vested interest there.
Yeah, he basically cannot
Mm.
become the critic that he wants to be. It's like, even like George R. R. Martin has come out and sort of criticized the 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 sort of adaptations that have come
Mhm.
out recently. Um, and to me, it's kind of a ballsy move. This HBO is basically his only connection to movies and TV
Mhm.
shows. It's his way of uh, getting more of his work out there, and he came out and straight up like insulted them basically.
Yeah, that's true. Though I'm waiting for him to finally finish, the final part of Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire.
Well, it's
Uh,
interesting. Would
it's
you
been
agree with
10
sort
years,
of
right?
Yeah, but do you agree with AM's sort of view of the whole thing, is that it can't be finished because of his inability to allow himself to actually have sort of heroic characters, heroic endings, instead of just pure nihilism?
Possibly. Possibly. I mean, there are many stories which don't have a happy ending, and or like a victory as the ending. There are many tragedies, right? So you get something like Oedipus Rex. Maybe this is one of the most famous, where um, Sophocles tells this very beautiful but haunting tale of Oedipus, who is now the king of Thebes. He achieved a great victory as a young man and saved the city, but now he's told that there is a curse on the city by the gods, and something evil lurks within. And so the play really focuses on him trying to discover what this evil is that he'll purge from the city. And he discovers it is himself, because by accident he killed his father and he slept with his mother. And this is like the worst possible revelation. He blinds himself out of the kind of agony of knowing this, the guilt of knowing this, and he leaves as a wandering beggar to live out his days in misery. This is not a victory by any means, and maybe says something quite profound about the Greek mentality of that time. So you don't, but is that a nihilistic story? I don't think it's nihilistic, because there is a strong sense of morality, right, in Oedipus. That he's a dirty thing because he's done these things, even though he didn't know he was doing these things. He's tainted. He's a kind of in a bad place. But there is something still very like there is a resolution to the story. It feels proper. It feels right. What happens there? What's different with Martin, perhaps, is that there doesn't seem to be that strong morality undergirding it. You can have a world which is dark and terrible, like Oedipus Rex, where or whether the gods fate you to be this father killing, mother sleeping with your mother character, right?
Yeah,
That's probably darker than anything in Game of Thrones, like in terms of if that actually happened to you, right? But
yeah.
like there's dark stuff there, but there's not. I don't think there's anything quite as horrific for a
There's definitely some
person.
competitive stuff, I think.
There's
Uh,
there's a lot of things which are inflicted upon people in
yes.
terms of like torture and awful murders and things like this. But what's terrifying about that is that you
Did it
made
to
these
yourself.
moral choices,
Yeah.
and that's what makes you evil, or that's what taints you. But that's by the by. That's comparable to me in terms of the darkness of that world.
Well, but it's different
But
in the
there's
sense.
nothing in Game of Thrones. It could is it so it could be like that, but I don't think it will be because it lacks that. Um, there's no framework, moral framework, or the mythological framework of the gods, for example, or something like that, which that world can exist in and kind of make sense of that awfulness. It's just it is nihilistic because there is nothing beyond to kind of almost redeem that suffering of Oedipus. Oedipus in King's Landing is just a pathetic existence, and that's it. There's nothing compelling there. So I think I think he's probably right on that. The other way to go, of course, would be to have like a character like Jon Snow be a sort of Aragorn and redeem the,
Yeah.
the the world. But again, that would fly in the face of the sort of darkness of A Song of Ice and Fire, the realism which prevents that sort of hero from ever being. He will be too impractical. He's too impossible for a world of Machiavellians, and thus he can't go down that route either. So
Well, if the
he,
point was that the gods are real and
mhm,
that they have actually chosen someone to be their hammer, basically, against the sort of nihilistic injustice that is Westeros,
yeah,
that if anything, that kind of would set up a reasonable thing, because the whole premise is sort of like magic has kind of in
mm,
reawoken in this world, right? There's dragons, there's zombies, basically. Like it's not like this world is our world. This world is our world, but suddenly things have come alive. Like, so
mm,
if that also means the gods have returned of some sort, sort of these powerful beings have that sort of created the world or something like that, came and basically determined this man was the hero that would be the savior. I don't think it would actually contradict what Martin has written previously. I think if anything, it would sort of continue on this sort of gradual storytelling that he's making, but I just don't think he can bring himself to do something to actually have a Aragorn figure.
that's a really good point, and I think you're right. I was reading a bit of Thomas Carlyle earlier, actually, and he has this very strong sense of history being a series of cycles of civilizations where, after a time, the creeds, the ways of being become shallow and lack authenticity, and no one even believes them anymore, but they are uttered to maintain the corrupt elite. But what comes in is, he would see it might be an individual, but it could also be the mob. They bring fire and brimstone. They purge that away. They overturn it. Now, whether that is channeled into something good and vital, like what you're describing, the hero who's going to bring kind of the natural laws or God's laws back into being in that place, reestablish them, maybe like a Jehu character, in the Old Testament, cleansing away the worship of Baal from the temple and so on. Or is it just going to be more anarchy and chaos? That that remains open to him. It requires the right people. But there is this sense of a when the rulers follow the way of wickedness, this there is like within reality something which kicks in, which always brings the punishment, the cleansing. It just happens. It's what happens in history. So you're right. That could like be a way Martin could go with this, but I think you're right that he won't go with it because it's not in him. He doesn't believe that to be true. He sees just oppression oppression through history until maybe one day we'll get the communist utopia, as it were.
Well, yeah, it's kind of
Um,
like, can you really write a story, or can a story really be good if it goes from basically this, a same situation to exactly the same situation, but with a different color of paint? Because
but that's what he sees history as being, I guess,
and
which
that's
is
the
the
sort of this that's even the skin suit mentality too. It's like,
mm,
yeah, the skin suit of Star Wars is the same. Like, it's they didn't even do anything creative with the uniforms or the look in the sequel trilogy.
yes,
It was straight up a copy. It was the most
hmm
boring. Like, one of the cool things about the prequel trilogy was that even though there was variations of the same thing that you could have seen in the in the original trilogy, but it's taken in such a different direction
mm,
that you could see that this is the same world, but it's obviously went through trauma or a drastic change. While at
yeah,
Martin, if it just ends where, like, okay, now somebody else is on the throne, but of course, it's just different people, or like, so maybe it's going to end with girl bosses, kind of thing. Well, were they any better than, Robert and the
mm,
end? I mean, Cersei is basically in the books basically became Robert, the thing she hated. She
yeah,
becomes the abusive, like, drunk that she hated to begin with. So what is that? Like, it's just a skin suit of the original, like, characters. Actually, even without even, like, remotely an aspect of morality, because the only person who kind of represented some morality was Ned.
hmm
And there's nobody who really can replace his character, at least not that George has written anybody that could take that spot. Jon Snow kind of could, theoretically, but even his premise of, like, of death and rebirth requires some, like, drastic change. Like, Jon Snow has to change drastically, and that means he's going to probably be not as moral of a character that he's supposed to be in previously. So
yeah.
how can you even, like, it's just going to end up like materially different, but spiritually dead.
You've put it brilliantly, Connor. It's I guess like it's with the what I was thinking about when you said all these things was contrasting it with Tolkien's history of Middle Earth, which we're not going to go into it now, the whole thing, because
Mhm.
it would take several streams.
Yes.
But he wrote an extended history over thousands of years that it takes place in Middle Earth.
He didn't take the 1,000 years, though.
He didn't take the 1,000 years. Sorry, I worded that badly. The history of Middle Earth he wrote, and that history spans thousands of years. And on a very superficial reading, somebody might say, "Oh, look, the Numenorians fought Sauron, the Gondorians fight Sauron. It's the same battles, but it's very different. The culture's different, the geography's different, and the people are different. And there's the emergence of new peoples, and there's rises and falls on a moral plane.
The
They're
spiritual
actually,
problem is even different. It's not
yeah,
like, we're not really dealing with the same battle, because even Sauron has
mm,
different strengths and weaknesses. Almost, he acts almost as sort of a derivative of himself, kind of like he's
mm,
kind of a different character in
yeah.
each age.
That's a very good point. He's yeah, the foe that is being fought is has poses a different challenge. Interestingly, the the primary challenge is still a moral and spiritual one.
Mhm.
In terms of Numenor, it is who should we worship? I guess would be the question, or should we be content with this life, as it were? Whereas for the relatedly but not identical, it is the Ring of Power, which is the main challenge to the in the Lord of the Rings, and it's should I take absolute power or not? Or how do I deal with that? You know, should I be content with this life or try and make Mordor into a garden as Sam is tempted? Which is a lovely temptation. Most people are tempted with, you know, glory and power and battles and being the victorious warrior, but not Sam.
Like,
He's
can I remake Mordor into my image, kind of thing. Like, most
yeah,
people are
and
tempted to that.
so I mean there is still like that is still a question of theology in terms of who do I worship, because it's taking on the role of God almost. You know, when you frame it in that, like making
Mhm.
Mordor into my image, but it isn't as explicitly as a different challenge to what
Yeah.
takes place in Numenor. So there's a change in the world, which is then gives life to those different ages. They're not just copies of each other, although there are parallels,
Yeah, it rhymes like George Lucas rhymes.
but it's not just the same. Whereas, so there's a there's a movement to things in a way that with what you've just described, there isn't a movement. The world just goes on with one ruler after another. Now, and everyone else just suffers.
There
In
is
fact, we
literally,
suffer too. So,
like, no change. Even in, like, Martin's, like, history that he proposes also,
hmm,
because he wrote sort of a at least part 1 of a history of Westeros or whatever. Nothing changes. There are, like, it's almost like
hmm,
there are minor liberalizations here and there, that, sort of basically for feminists, there are
yeah,
minor, um feminist wins occasionally, but it's obviously very minor because of where we are at, sort of, the at the time of A Song of Ice and Fire. He can't really make much change to the society unless he wants to have it be a utopia prior and then, like, collapse into sort of this nihilistic world. Which in some ways, I mean, he has these sort of grandiose figures, but he would consider them. I think he would probably say they're all myth, like, fictional. Like, they're all imaginary. Like, they didn't actually exist in the world that he created, or they were much less powerful than they were portrayed. Because he has
hmm.
a very, I would say, negative view on what how history has been relayed over centuries.
Yeah, and I mean it's I mean there's two things that came to my mind when you were saying that. One is and I think he would probably be sympathetic to this. Nietzsche had this in The Birth of Tragedy, which was his first major work. He talks about a distinction between the Apollinian and the Dionysian forms of story, which dominate ancient Greece. Apollinian is like your heroic epics, the Iliad, for example, or the tales of Odysseus, the Odyssey. These see, although there is much tragedy, ultimately heroic will triumphs over the darkness, and he would see that as um, a kind of illusion that we need to tell ourselves to keep sane in a world of suffering. Whereas the Dionysian embraces the reality of the darkness of life and thus is very kind of embraces ecstasy and hedonism, because it is the not so much an escape from that as just accepting that it would have been what does he say? It would have been better never to have been born. And so Martin, if we were to kind of steelman him, maybe he just thinks that kind of Dionysian view of life is correct, and the Apollinian is an illusion. And so, while the Apollinian makes for great storytelling, uh, the Dionysian worldview is more real, and so that's what he wants to convey in his tale. these are people who are dealing with the real world as he sees it, and they're not living in an illusion. But maybe before I go to my to the second point, I mean, what do you think that's a fair characterization of what he's doing?
That's probably true. The only thing that I would say about that is that it's it seems like it's because of the specific parts of like history that he has
Hmm.
read or that he has focused on. It seems like he focuses on maybe the most evil or seemingly evil moments of our history.
Yeah.
So to him there is no hero, but there's a lot of history that actually tells a different story about heroic moments in our civilization. You know,
Hmm.
there's a reason why people tell stories about heroes is because it's not a foreign concept. If there were never heroes of any kind, we wouldn't know what a hero was. Like you can't.
Mm.
I don't believe that there was somebody that just created the idea of a hero completely out of thin air.
No, that would be absurd. And
Yeah,
also, we know such people in our own lives, even if it's a small version of that, right? We
yeah,
see those
might be
traits.
very minor, but there's so much like I think that implies that there literally is no good,
Hmm.
and that must come from some self-hatred.
Unless you see it as like, and I see maybe he would probably just go further than this, but for somebody like Rousseau, man in the state of nature was innocent and had a wholesome kind of existence, but society uh, puts him in chains, and so all of social life is a kind of oppression of our original state. So all social life, all of history, is in a way a kind of imprisonment that we must break open. This in many ways is the left wing progressive attitude in various guises. That's what it comes down to. That there's some kind of oppression which we live under, and we need to open up those things. And because human nature is fundamentally good, it needs to be liberated from these um, arbitrary oppressions imposed on us by warlike men.
Mm.
But the
I guess I understand now why Daenerys's like last dragon was just let go. You know, because
right,
he was the only one that could be free completely. Like he was just, you know, like it doesn't matter the fact that he might go, eat a bunch of babies, like the dragons previously
mhm,
have done. Oh no,
yeah,
no, just let him go, let him go. He's
he'll be
free
fine.
now. He can be free from civilization.
Right. Well, and like in that time period, especially moving into the 19th century, anarchism very much reflected that kind of idea that if we could just return to a kind of primordial state, a pre-industrial world, maybe even pre-agricultural, then human life will be wholesome and good again. Now,
Pre-agricultural, that sounds terrible.
well, they had romantic ideas of human
Wh-
life.
What are you eating?
Well, you're hunting the deers,
Yeah,
you're
but that's not gonna be able to feed, like, people, like, enough people.
oh, you see, it's the evil industrialists have taken all the resources for themselves. The world is abundant as long as we share it to each man and woman. But my where I was going with this is maybe Martin. I think he kind of buys the social uh, is kind of imprisoning, but he also thinks that there wasn't a good primordial state. It's just always been like that, and there is no escape from it.
Well, that
So
just sounds
he's like a
horrible.
very pessimistic. Um,
Rousseauian?
well, Rousseau might even be the wrong person. It could be like Thomas Hobbes we're talking here. But even
But
he has a good state in terms of the good ruler.
yeah, exactly. I
Um,
was like, doesn't Hobbes make the argument basically that the monarch needs to sort of keep everyone in line?
well, and I mean,
to some
is there
degree.
characters that if there was a good king, like can there be a good king in Westeros? Maybe that's a question.
I mean, if that were well, the theoretical good king, or the king that they say is a good king, but obviously, George R. R. Martin doesn't really portray as necessarily a good king, would be like the conqueror, right? Like the one
Yeah.
who like he forged Westeros into one thing. So in
Hmm.
some sense, can you have a good Westeros or a good king of Westeros if the whole um the whole institution is folly?
Well, see, maybe that's maybe that's the kind of ultimate kind of critique he's trying to make here.
It
That it's impossible. Maybe it's more of a critique of empire in
or
some way.
maybe Napoleon.
Napoleon, perhaps, but that could only be sustained by maintaining the war march ever on.
But
It
for
as soon as
Napoleon
that
to be a
fails.
character, you would have to have something that he would have usurped that would have been like just
Hmm.
like something like the Holy Roman Empire as like an alternative. But
Yeah.
Martin can't do that either
No. No.
because
No. But I mean, if you were to compare it to like, m- I mean, it's an interesting point in a way because if you apply it to like modern America, which isn't officially an empire, but in civilizational terms is an
wink, wink.
empire,
Yeah.
both in terms of its relationships to other countries in the world. So, like Britain, for example, is for all intents and purposes a satellite state of America or a client state or
A
whatever you want to
puppet
do.
more so.
And yeah, well, yes, yes. I mean, Trump says something and British policy automatically reverses to be in line with Trump.
Well,
So
or even Elon kind of, even though he's
yeah,
fighting them, like, but he's like, it's like it's like a puppet fighting his like ruler, his overseer, basically. Like
yeah,
he's fighting, they're fighting it, but like they don't really have anything to fight him with.
right. And so America is an imperial power in that respect, but also the actual America itself. The it's the states are in many cases like countries with different cultures, languages, peoples, and you have all of these in one union,
I
which
would say
is
I can't say, I wouldn't say the states would be one country. I feel like you'd have to be regional, because I do think there's a strong like sameness. Like if you
mm, okay.
move from the Midwest, like it's pretty much the same. I mean, it's kind of like
Mm,
it's like Germany. Like Germany, obviously has cultural differences within Germany, but you'd still probably say they're one people.
I
Um,
see. Okay. Well,
like
I would maybe then regional would
yeah,
be a fairer description. But like the people in the Midwest feel like a different people to the people in New York
definitely.
and or California.
Oh yeah, yes.
So like so in a way, maybe he's also commenting on that. Can you keep that together? Is that a possible thing to keep together? Is there anyone who could be a good ruler of such an empire?
Yeah. But even
Maybe.
in the beginning of the United States, you could argue it was the South and the sort of the northeastern or north,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
um, colonies. They kind of were different to each other. So, but like from that perspective, you could argue like I I don't think anyone really would say George Washington wasn't a good president, like a
Mhm.
an orderly president, a president who had virtues and didn't sort of destroy the nation. Like the first, so like in some sense, like even though I wouldn't necessarily agree with George Washington on everything or anything, I can't say he's not worthy of like being looked upon as a quality ruler. So would the
Mhm.
argument be that George Washington wouldn't be like, what's his point? I guess
Well, to be
Does he
fair
know?
to him, what you described earlier, the conqueror formed Westeros, and maybe in this very loose analogy, Washington is almost like that. He is the
Ooh.
leader of those who form the Union,
It's even
or
geographically kind of works too,
but
as like
then
King's
yeah,
Landing
mm, yeah,
is
yeah,
Washington.
and then it stretches out across. But now we're in like the late stage of that, or a very long time later, where things have developed and groups have maybe grown apart from each other, whereas once it was closer, and the quality of leadership has declined. I don't think anyone could possibly kind of argue against that. And
Yeah,
I'm
no,
not just talking individual like leaders. I'm talking like the class of leadership in many countries has significantly declined.
oh,
Um,
you mean in our world?
in our world, yes, yes.
Are you talking about their world or our world?
I'm saying both worlds.
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, I would say though, I mean, I guess I point to the fact that I don't think Martin really has a good view of most of the rulers of Westeros.
Hmm.
Like, so in some ways, I don't know. Like, they all seem to have their secret evils that they are partaking in. Like,
Yeah,
that they don't really have like strong virtues. Like, it's more like they use propaganda to make it seem like they might have been good previously.
I see.
Like
Yeah.
Jaehaerys the Good or something like that. Like, I think he was called the Good or something. And like the more Tolkien, or not Tolkien, Martin writes, the more Martin writes about that reign, the more he's poking holes at the idea that he
Mm,
was a good king. Like,
I see.
he even's making the argument that, oh no, his wife, the queen, would have been better. Like,
Right.
she was the good aspects of him. Like,
Mm.
he by himself wasn't a good king. He needed her in order to make good decisions.
Yeah.
So,
So
like, he's the good king, supposedly. He came after sort of an really evil king, but then the more Martin writes about it, it's like hole there, hole there, hole there. Just
yeah, I mean, I guess you could. There is a value in the ability to revise opinion, because I think, especially given what we were talking about earlier, where there is a very uh, static and forced ideology in our, or at least there has been in our culture, which limits what can be said and what can be thought, and
Mhm.
has led to this kind of very shallow and fragmented uh, creative scene, if it could be called that. The ability to revise, or to offer revisions on history, is invaluable, because then you can reevaluate what let's take a much maligned king, Richard II, not Richard III. I'm not going to go there yet, but Richard II. Richard II is often seen as a very arrogant and prideful king who was a bit aloof and kind of had it coming when Henry Bolingbroke overthrew him. And certainly, kind of Shakespeare's Richard II, although there's certain degrees of sympathy, it doesn't portray him in a very good light. But this is also the Richard II who promoted Geoffrey Chaucer in his court and supported the arts, for example. Now, Chaucer's, Canterbury Tales are some of the greatest stories ever written. I think a king who supports that kind of thing had some good qualities to him.
Yeah.
Or maybe we can talk about a figure like Winston Churchill. Churchill, for many years, has been primarily lauded as, a great hero who saved saved the West, or something like this. He's become more than the man himself.
Hmm.
And that's not to say that he didn't have a certain bullishness and courage and real resolve in his designs. and what he stood for against the mid-century Germans. But from a British point of view, at least, he's also the prime minister who oversaw the transition of power from Britain to America in the world. At least the last remnants of power Britain had, the British Empire. He conceded a lot of ground to Roosevelt. That makes you question, was he a wholly good prime minister from our point of view? Actually, there's questions there. So the ability to kind of have a offer revisions on the consensus or contemporary ideas is actually quite good. So again, if you want to steelman Martin, it's not necessarily a bad thing. What is kind of then not good is then it seems from what you're saying, it tends in one direction and only in one direction. The subversion of any kind of real heroic, which is, that's not what revision is about. It's actually meant to open up the truth, and that will show the heroic where it is.
Well, yeah, it's kind of if you start looking at Churchill as being maybe more of a villain of some sort, right? Or at least a failed hero or something like that. Having more negative qualities, you then tend to see his adversaries, maybe the people who would disagree with him, in a more heroic light, right? Um,
Perhaps,
but the problem is
not necessarily. Not
Whoa, no, no,
necessarily.
not what I mean is adversaries like somebody who would say, "Oh, he shouldn't have cozied up to Churchill or not Roosevelt."
I see. Right. Yeah.
I'm not talking
Hmm.
about like who he was fighting. I'm talking about like
Hmm.
who internally would disagree with his opinions and
I
his
see. Yeah.
strategies and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Maybe theoretically going after the same goal, but taking a different approach
Hmm.
to achieving that goal. Because at least supposedly from Churchill's uh, statements, he, or at least at one point, wanted to maintain the British Empire
Hmm.
and destroy communism. Like those are
Yeah.
two things that he put forward as his goals, and he achieved neither of those goals. And
Yeah.
you could argue that he accelerated both. He accelerated what?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, he did.
So somebody who agrees with him, communism should be destroyed. The British
Hmm.
Empire should be maintained. The person who says both of those things and then disagrees with him on the way that he should have
Hmm.
gone about it, then you see see them in a more heroic light than you would maybe Churchill.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is that yes, you're right about that. So in Martin's work, if he was basically doing revisionism well in his own work, he would then be sort of, shining a light on somebody else and being like, oh, they were better. They were the real, like,
Mm.
goodness, I guess you could say. Like they were a good example of a king. They're not looked at as such often by histories as being the good king, but this person was actually the good king.
Hmm. I guess, and maybe to cycle back to something we said earlier, maybe part of this as well is he's looking at what sells books,
Well,
and what.
that's the advertiser in you. Like that's it. If
Right.
if you are taken over by the advertiser in you, that kills art.
But it sells, doesn't it? Because getting the juicy gossip, as it were, about a medieval king of Westeros, let's say, that is essentially what you've just described, and there's something within us today which likes to read that and indulge in it, and thus it's going to sell more than the stories of maybe a moderately good king isn't
Well,
going to be for,
maybe short term it will sell better, short term, but that's I guess the problem is that these types of people only think short term. Like I mean,
Mhm.
our modern man. is purely a short-term person, only
Mhm.
working towards short-term goals. Nothing, that I think that's kind of, one of the reasons you might not see, beautiful cathedrals anymore is that, it was a very long-term creation. It
Mhm.
took, hundreds of years sometimes to create the beautiful cathedrals, and there's no patience for that. So it's like, is he sacrificing his like sort of sellability, or or sacrificing the success or finishing the story for um
Mhm.
for like temporary good sales, like in the
Yeah.
now? Like, yeah,
Mhm.
maybe Game of Thrones, or maybe Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire will have great sales in the next 10 years, but will it have great sales in the next 50? Like, will it be able to
Mm.
stand up as and say that it's a um something that generations will go on to look back on fondly, as kind of Lord of the Rings is read for, beyond the death of the author.
Well, here's another one then in that regard, which I'd be interested in your view. Harry Potter, because I don't think Harry Potter as a series. I haven't read all of the books, and I think I've watched most of the films or bits of the films, so I couldn't tell you exactly everything that happens. But certainly from the ones I have seen, they're much more within the heroic archetypes of the past,
Mhm.
and it isn't kind of deconstructing the main characters, uh, or telling you that they're evil. Actually, there are brave and courageous and noble people fighting against the evil characters like Voldemort. And there's no question that Voldemort is an evil character as well.
Yeah,
But,
there's no attempt to sort of uh celebrate something about him.
but will that so and whereas like there are genuinely heroic characters as well, who some of them are flawed, they're all flawed, but they have heroism nonetheless. And the question I have then is, that was massive. Like in the 90s, early 2000s, it was a huge thing, sold millions of books worldwide. Will that be remembered or sold in 50 years' time? Um, you know, if not, or if so, why?
Yeah. I think the question is, will sort of her writing be still seen as a good place to go in
Mm,
the future? Because I would say she has a real, at least in the first books, she has a very simplistic style.
yeah,
It's very enjoyable, but I could see it returning to kind of a like very, it's like quintessential children's book, maybe. Like
yeah,
I would say children's books aren't like talked about as like quality literature necessarily. Not that they don't have good qualities, but they're not like
mm,
basked in as much as something like Lord of the Rings. They're not carried on. Like, I feel like the thing with Harry Potter, the reason it's still sort of very popular at the moment is because millennials can't grow up or don't want to grow up. Like,
yeah,
they have like they have a almost seemingly eternal fascination with their childhood,
mm,
and I think that's probably what keeps Harry Potter alive, is fascination with childhood.
mm,
While like something like Lord of the Rings is basically, there are no kids in Lord of the Rings, really. I mean, there's like one,
there's-
like, and
yeah,
um, but there aren't really kids in Lord of the Rings, even though the hobbits are small. They're all adults, basically. I mean, you could argue about Pippin, but he's the closest thing. But even Pippin, he's like, what is it? It's like, it's sort of the he's in the time of the hobbits where they're going out and sort of um before they become full adults, but they're basically, you could say like they're like 15 or 16 kind of thing, or like, they're where the Harry Potter he's where the Harry Potter characters kind of end up, while the Harry Potter characters start off as kids, right? Full-blown kids. I just don't think that children's literature will maintain a stranglehold on people's imagination as it did in the 90s and the 2000s because of this desire to stay in your childhood.
I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It is focused on, well, literally children going through school,
Yes.
and for the millennials, of which I'm a millennial. I do see that there is this kind of thing of the 90s now being seen as a halcyon golden age, and in some ways dreams of going to Hogwarts are maybe a kind of idealization of that. Whereas for future generations, that won't have the same ring to it, not least because they didn't live in the 90s.
Well, yeah,
So,
also,
yeah.
if you like for Gen Z, I think the 90s is a part of the growing problem, is a
Hmm.
part of decline. It's kind of
Yes.
like it's maybe a high point, but it's sort of like a high point it's a disguised as a high point, but
Hmm.
in reality a societal almost collapse
Oh,
that takes
definitely.
place.
Yeah.
I mean, with like Blair and Clinton, you really don't have very like impressive, like, I mean, skilled but not like worthy of admiration of
No,
figures.
no, and many of the things which have got worse since then have their origin in that time. The so Blair in particular was big on post-political committee work. So think of it like this isn't healthcare isn't a political issue, it's a technical issue, it's a scientific issue. So we'll set up a
Ah,
committee of experts to decide what should be done here, and anyone who disagrees is just disagreeing with the expert's decision. It's not a
is that kind
political issue anymore.
is that
So
kind
that,
of why he set up like a Supreme Court as well? Kind like
yeah, and lots of the kind of bodies that now exist in Britain. So Ofcom, this is it's not actually officially part of the kind of executive, but it is kind of one of these expert bodies who oversee what's put on television, for example. Or Ofgem, that's the energy regulator. You have all of these Ofsted, which is for education. And so these working to kind of bureaucratic frameworks will then dictate what can be done where and when. Of course, it's political because they're about decisions about human life, and they assume certain things in their decision making which are contentious. For example, during COVID, the COVID-19 situation, you had essentially one of these big committees, the SAGE committee in the UK, um, which would advise Boris Johnson and the government on what to do. Well, it was their decision that actually the longevity of life trumps the quality of life, perhaps, or the freedoms of people. And so their decision was to lock down the country. That was their recommendation. It was an expert's view. And if you remember at that time, oh, you disagree with the experts.
you want to
It
kill
wasn't
grandma.
it wasn't a question of, okay, is it worth you know what's the more important value here in terms of uh, survival at all costs versus liberty. Let's just put it, that's maybe a very simple way of putting it, but
Living life. Just
that's not like an expert's, like, you can't be an expert in that. That's not like that kind of thing. That's a moral, political, spiritual decision.
well,
But
don't say that you can't make an expert out of liberty. I think America has plenty of supposed liberty experts. They're called the ACLU.
well, that's true, yes. But you see what I'm getting at.
Yes.
It's not a technical question or a mathematical question alone. Like, you
Yeah,
can get
Yeah.
There's things that are being put in there. So you're totally right that the 90s are not this halcyon age. It's just, and many of the problems we have now, at least in Britain, and I'm sure it's similar in America, have their origins in that time. But it's just also, it's, I think what's changed are two things, well, three things. One, many of us have grown up, and when you're a kid, everything generally, if you've had a, a supporting family and community and so on, things were better. Quality of life and affordability of life was better.
Yeah.
Uh, people my age in the UK in the 90s could afford to buy a house pretty easily. Today it's really hard. That's a really like simple example, but cost of living in general is going up. It's harder to get good jobs, no matter what you can get at Panda Express, according to these people online these days. Your ability to move up the ladder in terms of jobs and careers has totally kind of crashed. Um, so it's a completely different situation in that, and it it's the material quality of life, but also like the story we're told is different now as well. Back then, it was things like Love Actually. I don't know if you've ever seen this, Connor.
I have not. No.
It's very big in Britain. It's a kind of Christmas rom com with all
Okay.
of these different stories. It's kind of awful, but there's this kind of there's this despite all of the kind of awful things that happen in it, there's this very strong optimism. To be in Britain, you're going places, you can do things. I would see like The Matrix around this time is a similar sort of vibe. It's we're going to break free from the illusion and we can start our utopian rave forever. It's all going to be great. Um, there's real kind of sense of opportunity, and that the stories we're told today, it's like the West is evil and we must overturn all of it to maybe have some kind of mediocre life.
Hmm. Yeah. It,
That's
it, it,
about it.
it definitely. It's just it is a really completely different world that there was even a sort of more of a uniform culture to that there wasn't as much of a multicultural sort of takeover. So you can have
Yeah.
more of a story that pleases a a large group of people that has actual meaning. One of the reasons that a lot of superhero movies did so well was because it was sort of they were sort of grasping at the last remaining things that people kind of agreed upon,
Hmm.
and it just wasn't very like deep things. It's very very simple, just like bad guy hurts people, so stop him. Like
Well,
that
yeah.
was the thing that we agreed on. That was almost the lowest common denominator.
Well,
Um,
now we don't even agree on that anymore.
well,
But
that's why they can't make anything anymore.
but also, maybe this is a kind of side thing on this. The internet has changed everything in that regard as well, right? Um, when in the 90s, some people would use computers and the internet, but it wasn't a widespread thing. So most media was through the cinema or the television, and it was quite common in the UK for there to be certain shows which many people, if not a large proportion of the population, had watched. And so then you go into work and you can discuss it the next day. You can discuss what happened in the latest episode of EastEnders, for example,
Mhm.
which is a long-running soap opera. You would have people who would talk about the latest films that had come out, because that's what these were, cultural moments and events. Certain individuals, celebrities, would become famous amongst large proportions of the population. And even when I was growing up, children of my age, it didn't matter if they went to my school or not, watched the same TV shows. new played the same games. So we had things like Beyblades. I don't know if you remember Beyblades, Connor. You're probably too young for these
I've
things.
never heard of that.
Or Crazy Bones or Pokemon cards. Maybe you've
Okay,
heard of Pokemon cards.
I only know that latter, even though I've never played or done anything with Pokemon.
Okay. So or there were certain TV shows, right, that we watched, and I could mention it, and they would like, oh yeah, that was great. Whereas now with the internet, it's so um, it's fractured that common culture, whether it was
It's like
good or bad, and
resegregated.
it's resegregated, and so it's like a million choices that everyone has, and that means everybody's kind of divided off into their little sub communities. And
Hmm.
so the closest thing you get is like a big fandom where all these people belong to one fandom because they share an interest in that one thing. So that might be like Star Wars or whatever. Now, of course, now we see the problem with that is that it's the people within it disagree about where they want it to go, and so on, and there are a lot of
Well,
bitter infighting. But
I
in
would say it's more
theory,
like some people want it to go somewhere, and then other people have no interest in it going. It just sort of like stagnating. The creators want it to sort of stagnate because they don't have any
hmm,
direction.
yeah, yeah,
S- So they recycle things. They're basically just constantly recycling things.
but it's also a very different Unity, isn't it? Because the previous one, it was more casual. Everybody just watched the same stuff, so it wasn't like I've chosen this in the way that one chooses to be a member of a Star Wars fandom, if you
Yeah,
see what I mean.
yeah.
Like
It's not like political parties. Basically, it's not.
yeah, you just watched it and then you could talk about it as a common touch point. Whereas now you can't assume the common touch point, and the only ones you can is because people are really invested in that thing that you
It's almost
share as well.
it's almost parliamentarian too. Like
Mm,
while in America there's just two parties. There's so like you're either on side or you're not on the side. You know that
what about the libertarians though? Do they not get a mention?
they cannot get a mention because they got less than RFK Jr. on the ballot and he wasn't running anymore. So
That's
when
funny.
when you lose to somebody who's not really trying to become president anymore,
Mm,
that's I think that's a problem because like they had substantially like that might have killed the Libertarian Party because they might have lost like
mm.
access to the ballot in many different states because of how
Oh right,
poorly they did.
I
Um,
see.
so that party might be actually dead, like for future existence. But
Yeah.
really, when Parliament, you have so many different parties that you could be affiliated with. You have so many
Mm,
options, and that's kind of in some ways what the culture is become.
mm. Yeah, that's true. It becomes a very strong tribal grouping in a way, and
And
that in
even like
part explains the ferocity of the kind of conflicts in the fandoms actually, because it's more than just a passing interest. It's like you're attacking something that I've devoted my time, energy, and love towards, and have made a part of who I am.
and
Like I identify as a member of this fandom, and now you're destroying this thing that I love. Like I'm
well,
going to defend it, right?
it's even segments of those fandom. Like there are
Mm,
sort of the pro Disney uh parts
yeah.
that are basically subsidized more so um,
Hmm.
by Disney itself, and then there are so the anti, and then there are probably some moderates within that too. Like it sort of breaks down just like a political organization. Then there are probably the people who don't even think; they just watch. Like they're like those are like I want to see if this comparison is correct. You can tell me. They're like the liberal Democrats of uh of the fandoms. Like they're not really they don't really like have any real point to them. They're just kind of there to participate.
Well, I think some of the Lib Dem voters do have something going on. I will
Oh, okay.
defend them. I've met some of them, but the actual party, you're so right for the current moment, because the current leader. So we had a general election earlier this year. I know you discussed it with AI, Shai Tory,
Mhm.
but the the Lib Dem leader, his campaign was not to speak about any of his policies, but just do entertaining stunts,
Yeah.
basically. So, like, he did a bungee jump, he did dancing, I think he did surfing, and like this is all he did, right, for his whole campaign,
See,
and still people voted for him. So,
see that
like that
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 tells
was
you,
exactly what I was thinking of.
and he's still doing it. Like
Yeah.
recently, he was like, "I'm playing FIFA for charity." I'm like, mate, if I want to watch like gaming on YouTube, I'm gonna find a proper like YouTuber who does gaming. I'm not gonna watch some politician who wants my vote. Like
D-
this is so sad. But people will vote for him because of that kind of thing.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They're getting the voters who are just there to sort of participate, and like
Mm.
they don't really think about anything.
Yeah, I mean that's an indictment on British politics if ever there was one.
Well, to be
Yeah.
fair, I it's kind of the maybe the Green Party in some ways. Like they're just kind of there.
Well, the Green Party are very ideological
I
in
mean,
Britain.
in America,
Oh, okay.
in
Okay.
America, yeah, they're ideological, but they have no point to them. Like as a
Mm.
party, they have no shot of getting like because Democrats are basically a monolith. Like
Yeah.
you're either on the Democrat side or you're the enemy.
Mhm.
So the Green Party always gets blamed whenever they get too many votes that then supposedly makes the Republicans win.
I
So
see.
basically, there's no real like they don't really have a backbone because they're just there. You know, they're just kind of like there's like a few ideologues who really want to make a difference, but leftists in general in America are very like team focused. They were like Democrats are our team. So whatever
Yeah.
Democrat does, we support Democrat. That's where
Yeah.
vote blue no matter who comes from. Like that
Right.
that is literally a message from the Democratic Party or from big Democratic like supporters. Vote blue no matter who. Like doesn't matter what they say, doesn't matter what they do, you know, could be you know a an abusive person, just vote blue.
Just vote blue.
Like
Um, yeah. I mean that sums up politics today, and storytelling today in many ways as
yeah,
well.
we have that people have turned sort of fandoms into their own sort of political realms because it's almost because politics is almost is too toxic
Mm.
for those types of people. So they want to basically they want a political feeling or you know something that can bring them into something a community that they can be politically active, but it's too controversial to be a part of a actual political movement.
Yeah.
So you have to be part of a fandom supporting a certain way or, you know, whether
Hmm.
you support the sort of status quo or you want something different to be done, like those are the different political lines within these fandoms.
Very much so. Very much so.
But so
And
what should we be doing, you know, that's sort of a long conversation just to get to like the original question.
yes, yes. I mean, that's in a way that points in part to some of the difficulty with the question, is that there isn't an obvious and clear way forward. We face many challenges on all sides, and the the mainstream culture for the time being, whilst there may be some changes, so there may be less shrill in times of in promoting progressive politics, that we might start to see a change in that direction. Nonetheless, is it going to be rich and vital? I don't think so, because of the things we've been discussing, that it's still too political or politicized first and foremost, that it's where it's all skin suits all the way down, and there's a lot of big money interfering with and committee decision making interfering with these stories. So in terms of the kind of broader culture, I wouldn't expect much in the way of rejuvenation. But for ourselves, many of us want to create art and write stories, and in a way, we're searching and making those things that we feel are lacking. But I think, to me, then we've kind of touched on a lot of this already, and we've maybe in the conversation there's some seeds there. Think of what we were talking about with uh, A Song of Ice and Fire, where the story doesn't end in nihilistic kind of forever suffering and oppression, but actually there is a cleansing fire or restoration or rejuvenation of Westeros, um, in some form or another. Is that the kind of story that's needed today, where there are a lost and broken people have the return of the king, as it were, but
Well,
maybe in a slightly grittier way than the Lord of the Rings?
well, you
Then
could have.
perhaps.
There's so much options because you could really just have. You could have a destruction, but
Hmm.
a destruction that, because of the destruction, leads to some glimmer of light, like
Yes.
glimmer of possibility.
Hmm.
Like you don't like you can have this sort of tearing down if you want, but there has to be some point to it. I
Well,
think
I
that
mean
I,
that
I think that's
that
the
I mean, in a way, the Aeneid, it gets to this, right. The destruction of Troy is a tragedy, but Aeneas gets away, and this leads to the founding of Rome.
yeah.
So this is like the hopeful is brought, or in Middle Earth, that the equivalent of that is Elendil and his sons escaping the destruction of Numenor, and thus founding Arnor and Gondor, which become two of the great civilization in Middle Earth,
Or
and
the
will be.
destruction of Gondolin, the fall of Gondolin is the sort
Mhm,
of the propeller of the the Valar
mhm.
intervening to cleanse middle Beleriand and Middle Earth of its corruption.
I agree. Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's you're right. It's the precondition for that salvation to come.
But
Um,
you could end the story with the fall of Gondolin. You could
yes.
end it there. You don't have We don't have to see the next part. But there is something still, there's some hope even within that, because you could think about it as in like sort of I can't remember who the character, the villainous uh elf, who the dark elf's son, I can't remember what his name is, who, he's thrown off the walls,
That's
uh,
right. Yeah.
after he tries to throw off uh, Erendil, the kid. He's like a kid at the time, and he tries to throw him off, and he gets himself thrown off instead. Um, that kind of, like, the villain is, or a villain is getting
Was it?
some version of comeuppance, even though
Hmm.
uh, the villain, the overall villain Morgoth gets his victory, at least as far as he can see it.
Was it Maeglin?
Yeah, Maeglin. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that would be a very satisfying ending to see the punishment of Westeros in a way. And I mean, you could read Daenerys's genocide of King's Landing in that way if you really want to, but it's not done in the right. It's not pulled off in the right way, but it could definitely be presented in such a light if
Well,
you
yeah,
really
but
wanted to.
the problem with the end of the TV show is, first of all, they did such a terrible job with
Hmm.
with leading up to it, and
Yes.
then they did a terrible job of people actually getting their logical
Hmm.
comeuppance afterwards. Like it's almost like nobody gets in trouble, or like there's a trial in which the man on trial decides who's going to become the next king.
Right.
I mean, just think about how ridiculous that is. Um,
Yes. I mean, it
it,
didn't make much sense. It wasn't pulled off right. It wasn't executed well. But you can imagine a scenario where Daenerys is what you're describing, that destruction, but then there's a seed of hope left
well, you
in
can
some way.
imagine it much more in the books because Daenerys is not a purely heroic character.
Yeah.
She is a much more she's much more gritty, like all the rest of the
Hmm.
characters.
Yeah.
While in the show, they kind of made her a savior
Hmm.
figure uh, that then turns bad. In in an unclear manner, it kind of just seems like she goes crazy. Like
Yeah. She goes
it,
paranoid, right?
yeah, but like the music makes her go paranoid. Like there's no real evidence that she should go paranoid. It's that, like the
Mm.
ambiance makes her go paranoid. It's like when the if the music changes, then suddenly the character changes. While
Makes
like
sense.
it
Makes
should be
sense.
a combination of like the actions, or like her motivation be should be the reason she goes crazy, not the music, basically.
Yeah. No,
I
I
mean
mean that's fair.
that's an oversimplification of what took place, but in some ways that's kind of how it feels like it happened.
But yeah, I think there's definitely something there to what you've said, and so on the one hand, in terms of like the kinds of stories we may be looking for, maybe it has to be stories which point towards that in some ways. If we're talking like epics, um, I would also add just stories which touch on the real and kind of move beyond or return to what our natural selves in a way. Return to what's true and good. Now it's easier said than done, but stories which explore that have that kind of intangible substance, which means that they resonate and reawaken us to who we are as readers or as film viewers or whatever. And that doesn't just apply on an individual level, but on community levels. So that might be looking at history and maybe retelling it in a way that recovers what it meant to be an Englishman or an American or something like that.
I was gonna say, isn't that isn't the American part in some ways almost impossible?
Well,
In
perhaps somebody needs to give it a go.
Well, yeah, well that's the question. So what I mean is there's just not a lot of history to take from, as much as like something like England,
Hmm.
what it
But
means
I
to be.
mean, 200 years at least, 300 years is still a long time.
I'm not saying
And
it's impossible. I'm just saying that it's like you would have to connect it with British history, with English history as well. You'd
mhm,
have to see America as a continuation, not as something wholly distinct,
yes, yeah,
for it to make any sense. Or you could also lean into some of the other European
mhm,
sort of histories that that's why like something like that's why Disney movies originally, like the original Disney stuff, like Walt Disney's actual work, works because he takes from
yeah,
a plethora of European stories, and retells them sort of in something that's sort of like a mythical American
mhm,
state. Like almost like what an American kingdom, or what would America look if it was medieval or something like that. Like that's sort of like
yeah,
because like all the people have all the leaders, all the not leaders, the protagonists have American accents, transatlantic American accents.
yes, mhm,
So they all represent America in some way, but they're calling back to stories that are of European, um, you know, heritage. But I have a question for you. Is there a novel by a particular author in the last year or maybe two that has been released that is on sale that you would say was is worth reading that sort of personifies what we are looking for, or an alternative to the fiction that we are thrown at by, or thrown out by our overlords? Like, is there a novelist in the last couple years that might give us some an interesting read? Um,
Hmm.
because I don't actually know of any recent books that have like become popular. Are there ones that you'd say in our sphere might be worth reading?
I mean, there's definitely books in our sphere which are worth reading, and are very good. I don't know if they're quite what we've been discussing here in terms of that maybe new story, but they're getting closer to that, and they definitely are very good stories. So let me get the exact names here. Um, there's a fellow online called Isaac Young who has written various stories, including the Domes of Calrethia, which I think is pretty good. You've got Roots of Roots of Day, i.e. Philippocrit. He's written a story I really loved, which was The House of Noth. That is again, it's not what we've been describing in terms of that big story, but
Sure.
it's a very good fantasy and a bit different, um, and kind of maybe tapping into other things which are very relevant. King Emperor Penguin writes very good stories, and I would also recommend the Corncrake magazine, where a lot of these authors have published shorter stories or excerpts of stories, and it's becoming a real focal point for a lot of people in this community to share or to even start writing stories, which is a good thing.
You
You know,
yourself have one or more
I've had a couple of stories in there. I've got another one coming out in March. But that I'm not recommending it just because my stories are in there. I promise you that. It's actually the quality of story writing in there is phenomenal, and I'm honored to just be amongst, some of these authors. But I'm unsure if we've yet seen that kind of decisively new, or maybe not new, but that kind of turn in the storytelling that's going to be needed, or maybe is where we might be good to start exploring. um it's tricky though. It's tricky. I mean, the other thing I wanted to say on this, Connor, was that in a way it's not just what we write. We're only going to be able to write these things if we're actually living in a and feeling deeply within ourselves that these things are true. And that comes from participating in a certain attitude towards life, an openness to reality, which is fed in itself by the activities we do. And I would argue that participating in things like uh, the Mass, for example, you as a Catholic participating in the Mass are rejoining the ultimate story, which is at the heart of reality. And so it's by feeding on these things which is also going to inspire our own writing in this direction, because fundamentally, well, we both share the belief and in the reality of 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 God in Jesus Christ, who does overturn great evil and does redeem us on a kind of eternal plane, but also on a temporal level. This happens through history, and the
Mhm.
scriptures tell such stories as well. Moses is sent after 400 years of slavery to free the Israelites on behalf of God, and God does these amazing works through that. That's not a story of oppression forever, even though the Israelites mess up almost immediately, right? you
Yes.
know but
Yes.
you see what I'm trying to say? Like there's a power there that if we want to see such things today, we believe that power is going to have to move again in
Mhm.
people, in communities, in history. And
There's
so
hope.
if you really feel that, that's going to come through in your story in a sincere way. But to me, the issue today is many of us do not, I'm not blaming people for this. This is how we've been raised. This is the world we live in. I don't feel that deep within me, that conviction. I believe it in my mind, but I need to cultivate that. I need to ask God to give me that. I need to go to, you know, church and read my scriptures and participate in those activities which help elevate my heart to see with faith, the eyes of faith, those, and with hope, those things more fully. And that's a hard thing in this individualistic, narcissistic, uh, how many other words can I add to this? Very wicked culture, right? So it's
Decadent.
difficult, decadent, and especially when it's very easy to be isolated, not in a community which is participating in that worldview, in that world, not seeing the world for what it is. But nonetheless, I think in a way we ourselves have to first kind of enter into that story or be brought into that story before we can then tell it ourselves.
Yeah.
And Tolkien, again, I'll point back to Tolkien or to Lewis or to all of these people. They had that very deep-seated conviction in their lives. I don't think anyone can look at Tolkien and see a man who was insincere in his faith, or
Well,
Lewis.
unfortunately, there are people that claim that it's Lord of the Rings is a pagan story.
Okay, well, they can say that if they like, but Tolkien was a deeply committed Catholic
I'm
who,
just saying that I'm not saying I disagree with them wholeheartedly. It's just amazing how you can still get those types of people.
well, they're again, that's the sort of thing where somebody's blinded to reality by their own desire for something to be true or an ideology or something like that. Um, it's a rather bizarre, really, because it doesn't reflect anything on whether Christianity is true or not, whether Tolkien was a Christian or, like how good Lord of the Rings is. It draws on pagan and Christian ideas. It's not a one or the other, but his Christian faith is clearly a huge impact upon the redemptive character of the history in the Lord of the Rings. And so the same with Lewis, who converted to Christian faith from atheism. The Chronicles of Narnia, or the Paralandra, you cannot read these without feeling that the man himself, the man writing this, feels that world, that story to be true in some deep sense about our world.
You have to feel that way in order to
Mhm.
make other people feel that way, I think, in your work. Like, so
Yes.
the fact that both Lewis and Tolkien make people feel such strong convictions
Yeah.
from their work, I think that's an example of how sincere they were.
And so if that's our challenge, then I think is to, before we even write the story, do we have that in our lives, that conviction? Because if we lack that conviction, our stories will not be able to generate that feeling in somebody else. I think.
I think
Um,
that's one of the I don't know if you've read
yeah.
any of this person's books, but I kind of feel like that hollowness kind of comes out in Andrew Clavin's books.
I've not read his works, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it just they seem like they are like trying to mimic that
Mm,
more like that with his sort of more religious related books, sort of some trying to mimic that
mm.
sincere belief, but not fully. embracing it.
That's interesting. I mean, I can. It could also be. It's difficult. Tolkien and Lewis belonged to an age where it maybe was still very possible to cultivate that deep conviction, and I have no doubt some people are still able to, but it's probably a lot harder than it was. Well, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. They both had very supportive friends and colleagues who also helped cultivate that within each other, and
Yes, friendships.
um, they had friendships. You know, the Inklings. They're reading together. They share with Charles Williams and Owen Barfield. Broadly, they all share these convictions, and they reinforce that in each other, and they celebrate that in each other. So that's going to help you beyond your own religious, um, activities, beyond your participation in Sunday worship and discipleship and so on. They had people who were there doing the same thing, helping
Yeah.
each other. So maybe that's part of it for us too. That maybe we need groups like that who
Hmm.
can reinforce those convictions. And that's one of the difficulties is actually there are many great people, many great artists, story writers in our community. But what's our community? It is broadly defined as internet anons who are united by being against progressivism in one way or another.
Yeah.
That leaves open a whole range of things, which, if people are even convicted about these things or feel very strongly in themselves, there's a lot of disagreement. So actually, then in a way, maybe there needs to be a narrowing down into subsets of that to cultivate those convictions in each other. So, like, I would see, well, yeah, like you would be Tolkien, I would be Lewis in this situation, potentially,
If
um,
only.
if only. But that kind of thing could be
Mhm.
possible between us. Whereas I don't feel like a pagan or an atheist, while we could have a lot of in common, it
Or at
wouldn't
least
have the
interesting
same
discussions.
interesting discussions, but ultimately it wouldn't have the same bolstering effect for us
Yeah.
to have like as a group. So I think that's probably something to consider as well in this. So I mean, what do we do with stories? That's like a whole range of things. I mean, what is there anything that you would say, Connor?
I don't really have anything else to really add. I think you
Mm,
summed up very well I mean, what our way forward is in many ways. I mean, read good stories. That's
read good
one thing I
stories.
would say. I mean, that was I think that's more or less implied though by what you already said. Uh, I don't think any of us would want to go into these bad stories,
Hmm.
and I guess I guess we do need to just move away from pure criticism of things into
Yeah.
creation. And it's kind of wondering, like, I don't know if any or how many people have read like the critical drinkers books. um he has like spy
That's
novels.
right.
I've
Hmm.
never read any of them. I don't know who's read any of them. I don't know if they're any good. I
He
don't
has
know if,
tried to promote them on his channel. Like, he
what'd
does
you say?
try to promote them on his
Yeah, I'm just
channel.
saying, have you, like, you haven't read anything he's written, right? Yeah.
No.
But like he seems like the quintessential critic, kind of. But
Well, it's in his name.
well, yeah,
It's in his name.
exactly. He's the quintessential. He owns the critic part. Um,
And
but
the drinking. Don't forget that.
and the Scottish part.
Yeah, yeah. A
But
certain stereotype of it, yeah.
is he a quality writer? I don't know. I guess,
Mhm.
should we be reading his stuff, or like I wonder if he's one of those people who just like can teach, kind of, in some sense, like a teacher can't do, kind
Mm.
of thing. Like a
Yeah, well, and
teacher
also
teaches
because
because he can't do.
his criticisms though are often, oh, this woke stuff, which is like how
Yes.
we would frame it. This woke stuff has ruined good storytelling, like we had in the 1990s, and actually
Yeah.
we need to return to some kind of liberal meritocracy that we had in the 1990s, and that's so his stories or his storytelling. This is pure conjecture. I have not read his stories, but they're going to follow that. They're going to still be within that kind of framework, which feels very tired now and doesn't speak to the current moment.
Yeah, well, that's why I would never probably pick up his book on like
Hmm.
without, I would never put money forward or anything like that,
Yeah,
in order, or even maybe spend the time to read his book, because that's exactly what I would imagine his story is going to be about. Is basically it's going to go back to the 90s, and I bet the 90s books or 90s movies are probably higher quality in the sense that they more
hmm
personify the 90s because they're actually in the 90s. Like it's hard to imagine you going back to a time to sort of represent that experience when you already have that experience in many different forms.
and in a way, this also gets to the fatigue aspect we were talking about earlier. That to take Lord of the Rings, that is, filmed and made in the 1990s and released 99, is it? And then
Well,
2001, 2005,
yes, the
is it?
the
Or
first one I think either the first one comes out in 2000 or 1999, something like that.
so it's around that time. It's at the end of the 90s that these are
Yes.
made. And um,
It was produced, like the production began in the
mhm.
90s and everything sort of came out in the 2000s.
Yeah, so it's of that time and it has that optimism to it. And if you my one of my kind of uh thoughts about it is that it strips a lot of the uh kind of more uh how would you put it,
Whimsical,
well, whimsical, providential, and
spiritual.
spiritual, and maybe kind of um stronger emphasis on like ethnic difference or species difference within it. So like, oh, we'll have no men entering the Shire under Aragorn's rule. Like that kind of
Yeah.
idea is never even mentioned. But let's move aside from that. It's so, what do they fight for? There's some good in this world. It's a great speech, but it's a kind of thing you might hear in the 1990s. Like,
Yeah, they sort of they
mhm,
embrace it's not like the Tolkien doesn't have some of those like sort of elements in his work,
mhm,
but it's more that they highlight the specific elements that
yes.
fits in with the 90s sort of attitude.
Right, we're gonna like fight for universal human rights or something like that. That's what Frodo is going to destroy the ring for. And
Well, he does
this
make an
is
argument of the Shire, it's like, in like subtly, I guess they make sort of that, in the sense that like
mhm,
what keeps him going is the callbacks to the Shire. Like
yeah.
he's not called back to a generic like man.
No, no. And those elements are there in the Lord of the Rings, so you're
Mhm,
right about that, but I think it's like stripped of, for example, Frodo in the books is very like, I was chosen for this quest,
mhm.
and it not by any individual, right?
Oh, and
It's
Aragorn's like, "This is my right."
right.
Like,
Strong
I
emphasis on kinship.
I will earn it, but it is my right to take. It is
Mhm.
my path. I'm not shying away from it. It is my destiny. This has to happen, or all is
Yeah.
lost.
So you have these ideas kind of stripped back a bit, and there's this strong kind of fighting against tyranny and so on. But I think it's with the spirit of the 90s. But then you get the Hobbit remakes later, and they start to feel a little bit out of place. It's the same kind of tone, although very overlong. and a bit bloated as a story, but in terms of tone, it feels a bit tired to me, a bit kind of, it's lacking something that the originals had. And then you get the Rings of Power, and I know it's a different era, but the way they've done it, it's very much in line with the Peter Jackson aesthetic of Middle Earth.
Well, it's
They've
not authentic. Then you can't remake the 90s. Like
right,
in
right,
the like no matter how much Peter Jackson sort of tried, and even then I think he wasn't prepared to try, given the sort of the chaos behind the scenes.
yes,
Um,
yeah.
he
Oh,
wasn't,
you mean with the Hobbit?
yeah, with the Hobbit. Like
Yeah,
he wasn't prepared to even try to replicate the 90s in like with his full strength. He was kind of already he was tired. Like
yeah, he was tired.
he was tired. So when you watch the Hobbit movies, you become tired. It's like it's the same energy. He wasn't tired in making Lord of the Rings. He was energized, if anything.
So yeah, there's this again, this idea of the author is expressed in their story, and so what the author has in themselves, their attitudes to the world, to reality, to history, to spirituality. It's a kind of obvious point, but they flow onto the page, and so
Well, think
you
about
can
how
have
much
all of these other things in
changed.
place, but that is really the heart of a lot of these issues.
Well,
It's
think
the
about how much
quality
has
of author.
changed though in like from like say 99 to 2001. Like how like
Hmm.
2001 was a pretty seismic shift in
Yes.
across Western nations. It's really
Hmm.
the beginning of terror.
Yeah, yeah, and well, and then extend that to now, 2021.
Hmm.
The world feels a long way from 2001. And well, in 2025. So like the the Lord of the Rings films, and maybe this ties in with the Harry Potter thing as well. They are. It was interesting how you put it. They're a safe. It's like you're safe in your childhood. So it's an escape from reality. I think Tolkien's works on, well, he talks about an escape from industrial robotic society as well as from the reality of death. But it's never like putting your head in the sand. It's actually to lead you to a new appreciation of what is good and right and just and so on.
I think that's
Whereas
just because the enemy,
there's a
the sort of
certain,
sorry, the thing that they're fighting is something that can cross generations.
yes.
Their purpose isn't something specific. While I think that something like Harry Potter is very time, it's very set in its time. In
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it becomes that I think there can be a kind of cutification or cosification of things as well, and so it's like, where can I retreat to? I would argue in some ways the reaction to the woke progressive kind of subversion of Star Wars, for example, kind of over oversells the originals or oversells the prequels. Like they were good films and were really great in some ways, but it becomes almost like anathema to criticize them at all.
what do you mean? By virtue of the badness of the sequels?
Right. Or that
Okay,
kind of thing. Like there's a kind of rose tinted cutification of what was there before.
yeah, that is the 90s. That's why they view sort of that's why like the Critical Drinker or somebody like that views the 90s with an insane amount of like uh hope or sort of like I don't know joy or view of
Mhm.
it being perfection, like a utopian view of the 90s when it comes to media.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Uh,
agree. So I think that's some, and this gets into the one of the issues I've kind of come across is the kind of the trad life, which is essentially an attempt to return to some kind of traditional way of living. And it's not that the things in the past are unnecessarily are bad or something like that. The issue with it is that there's a kind of retreat to something which seems cozy and safe. Of course, it's not exactly what it was like in the past because these people often still use phones and electricity and so on. But rather, it's a kind of hiding from the current moment in something which is all nice and comfortable, as
Well, you
opposed
need
to actually face. It's like if the Council of Elrond decide to throw the ring in the sea or something like that, or give it to Tom Bombadil to keep forever, it's not facing the problems head on. It's saying they're not. That it's putting away for somebody else, the next generation, to deal with.
it will just creep in. The
Hmm.
sort of everything else will just creep in around it.
Yeah.
But that's why sort of authenticity, I guess, is the key.
Mm.
Is that sort of you have sort of the Daily Wire. It feel their entertainment attempts feel very inauthentic.
Yes.
Very uh, very much looks like it's been created by a marketing department,
Mm.
kind of. And they're just given a different demographic. So like the Hollywood people are thinking, oh, we're gonna make movies for this demographic. Basically, the 50% of people that are fully on board with us. Let's just say that. And
Hmm.
we're not worried about the other 50% because how could we make both groups happy,
Yeah.
right? Well, the Daily Wire people are thinking along the opposite but same structure. It's like what will make the other 50% happy? And we don't have to worry about the other 50%. While an authentic creation isn't trying to necessarily make either side specifically happy, right? But it is, but it those types of things tend to actually make everyone interested instead of just one side or the other.
Yeah. I mean that's right. That's right. I think you've pinpointed it there.
Yeah. Well, but I think this is sort of the best place to leave our discussion. Maybe we might have to continue this in the future, maybe as things change,
Yes.
and maybe we've come to a better understanding. Our understandings. I don't think there's going to be this. This isn't gospel or anything. I don't think either of us would agree that what we put forward is necessarily gospel. Um,
Mhm.
and then I do want to. I think you'll be interested. I'm reading a book called Mount Doom, and it's basically a interpretation of Tolkien's work. It's sort of putting an interpretation, a formula on like how we can read Tolkien.
Oh,
An
okay.
alternative reading of Tolkien,
Yeah.
and I think you'll find it fascinating. But my goal is to finish the book. It's like 600 pages.
Mm.
It's very long. But my hope is to have the author on, and I think you as well as the rest of the audiences will find it very very outside the box of what has been put forward previously, which
Mm.
is to me crazy to think of because people have been reading Tolkien for all these years. For something to be sort of outside the box, it
Yeah.
has to be, um, but like also like very much, you know, possible. I guess I think it's definitely very much a very possible reading of it, but it's
Mm.
also very outside the box, and I'm look forward to getting the author on to help present that to us. But I just think a new way of reading Tolkien that it to me it's like mind blowing, uh, and I
That
don't want to
is,
give I don't
yeah.
want to give it away yet. So
Well, I can't wait. That sounds great, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes, awesome. Well, Nathan, thank you for coming on to discuss this with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's amazing to me that 2 hours and 24 minutes have gone by. I feel like I feel like it could have been 30.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
just kind of, it's amazing. So, thank you. Do you have anything else you want to add before we get going?
First, let me just say massive thank you for having me on. I've really enjoyed this, and it's given me a lot to think about. And I can't. I'm looking forward to following this up in in the future, because I think there's a lot that's been laid here that I'm hoping uh, we and the audience will go and kind of explore and act upon, and maybe we'll see some fruits of that in the future. But beyond that, just I would I've mentioned it earlier, but I would encourage everyone to maybe check out the Corn Crate magazine, because I think what they're doing over there is maybe a step in the right direction, considering what we've been talking about, publishing stories from the past, good classic stories from the past, but then also contemporary authors trying to make new stories today. So uh, check it out. Submit stories if you've got them. Go for it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, check out Nathan Hood's channel. I will have a link to that in the description. Go over there, subscribe. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please like, share, comment, subscribe on Plotlines. Thank you, everyone, and God bless.
God
Bye.
bless.